My life was falling apart. I just didn't know why. On the outside, I was doing great. I'd begun working in a career I'd dreamed of since I was a kid, and I was doing pretty great at it. On my way to achieving my goals years sooner than I'd imagined I would. On paper, I was living my dream life, or at least starting to build it. But I couldn't eat or sleep right. My emotions had always been a roller coaster for me, but this was different. I felt like I was living on a live wire. This feeling of pent-up energy and dread I couldn't explain, of bone-deep exhaustion and feeling like I was sleepwalking throughout my day. I was exhausted. I would wake up early, co-sign myself to forced productivity at work, knowing although my energy would crash by 1 p.m, around my lunch break, that I would have to slog through, push myself for the next 5 hours even though my body was screaming for rest. I had to ignore it. There was work to do. I'd often forget when I last ate, if I'd really just had that handful of dark chocolate digestive biscuits since breakfast. Had I eaten breakfast? Why was I always crying? Why couldn't I get along with my boss? Why did everything she did and say upset me? What day was it? When was the last time I had something to drink, and why are my hands shaking? My hands would shake at random times in the day. My white blood cell count was abnormally low. Random and scary diagnoses were floating around in my head. I was breaking down. But what would disturb me more than the physical issues was this feeling that my heart was broken, that somewhere in me there was this large open wound, bleeding out since I could remember. It leaked on and through everything. I couldn't stymie it, and the blood never stopped flowing. I'd referred to it before as emotional haemophilia. That, paired with the insatiable feeling of emptiness I felt, despondency, put me in a very dark and hopeless place. One of the worst seasons of my life. But in hindsight, the best. My body was telling me what my mind had been telling me for years, what I'd ignored or accepted as just a part of myself. My breakdown broke me down enough for me to finally, after years of pushing through that pain, to finally stop. Our lives are full of distractions. Things we do, listen to, watch, or behaviours we act on that take our attention away from ourselves. This is normal. Recreation, downtime, entertainment, and enjoyment are necessary components in a full and well-rounded life. But in the life of someone who can't stand themselves, whose thoughts are too loud, whose fears and concerns are overwhelming, these distractions act like numbing agents, a type of symptom management for the awful way we feel when it's too quiet and our thoughts are allowed to run rampant. These distractions distract and numb the pain we're either in, that we're avoiding, that by the time our mind and our body have had enough of carrying these things around unaided, it's usually too late. Our body begins to succumb to the long-held weight of pain, anxiety, and any suppressed trauma. We begin to become physically sick without realizing we already were. We were just too distracted, intentionally or otherwise, to notice it. However, the good thing about a breakdown, whether physical or mental, is that it finally gets us to stop, because it often shouts a lot louder and has far more debilitating and life-altering effects than our distractions. A breakdown is our body and mind refusing any longer to be ignored. Maybe you've already had one or are in the midst of one. Maybe that's what brought you to the podcast. And to that I want to say, welcome. I know what it's like and that this is an opportunity. Maybe you can feel a breakdown brewing, or you've been feeling sick for a while and it seems to be getting worse, harder to live with. To that I want to say also, this is an opportunity. An opportunity to learn how to live in a way that doesn't compromise your well-being and your health. I think breakdowns are necessary. They don't have to be for any dire reason either. To me, a breakdown is synonymous with hitting a hard pause on life and using that time to rest, recuperate, and negotiate with yourself just how you're going to carry on living. Everybody needs this. You don't have to be sick to do it. In a mainstream and more socially acceptable sense, this is often the point of a sabbatical, which is taking a year for every 7 years you've worked to take a break. figure yourself out and do your own thing. Your breakdown is your sabbatical, an opportunity to take your needed time off. What I'm suggesting you consider doing, if you're able, on your next step to learning how to love yourself, is to hit pause. To stop what you're doing, put aside the distractions, and deal with your current reality. Many of us never stop. Our society is designed to place productivity over well-being and health. Daily life is noisy. The radio, news, TV shows, magazines and newspapers, podcasts, cars, planes, trains and automobiles. We are so used to being in constant motion or being plugged into the current of social motion that we never just stop. Stopping allows you time to think about 3 important things you have to consider with brutal honesty. You need to assess, reevaluate, and respond. ARR. Assess. What is my current reality? What am I hiding from and avoiding? Reevaluate. How is all of this affecting me? How do I feel about it? Can I carry on like this? Response. What do I let go of and what do I take hold of to continue on? This means, what do I quit or start? What do I deal with or let go of? I'm not asking you to do any of these things yet, nor would I advise you to do it if you're in an uncertain life position. Safety and security need to be the priority. What I'm asking you to do is listen to yourself. Not the you that is chattering within you constantly with worries, to-do lists and expectations, but the body mind. The body mind, one word, is a term coined by American neuroscientist Candace Pert, which is referenced in Gabor Maté's book, The Myth of Normal. Body mind describes the oneness between our emotions and feelings in the mind and the effect they have on the body and vice versa. Here's how Maté describes it. Body mind describes the oneness between emotional perturbations or any other chronic upset imposing physiological burdens that can result in illness. So essentially what this means is that if your body and mind are one, and separated, that chronic upsets and burdens negatively influence your health, and vice versa. They both influence the other, intrinsically, and can't be removed or isolated from one another. For example, Maté points out the link between chronic negative emotions and disturbances and chronic illnesses, particularly autoimmune diseases like ALS or rates of breast cancer in women, and cardiovascular disease in relation to chronic stress. Or, for example, anxiety and stomach aches, teeth grinding and IBS, bedwetting and migraine headaches in children who have been sexually and physically abused, nightmares and insomnia when there's intense stress. Our body-mind is always speaking. It is always communicating and influencing each part as a whole. It communicates how you are currently living your life is affecting you, both the positive and the negative. Awareness of this connection to yourself gives you autonomy, because with each insight you record, you're gaining wisdom about yourself, on how you respond to certain situations and what you need more or less of, not what you assume you should, could, or would need. With that wisdom comes power, the power to respond. When you're informed about the reality of your being and situation, your responses and decisions aren't from a place of ignorance, fear, and confusion, and are therefore a lot more likely to be accurate, yield beneficial results, and give you the truth of what it is you actually need to do to move forward in your life. Knowledge is power after all. When you find out the root cause of your upset or illness, instead of just treating symptoms, you're equipped to begin healing the root cause and setting yourself up to live a life without its effect in the future. According to Gabor Maté in The Myth of Normal, what constitutes normality in our society isn't normal in a natural or physiological sense at all. Hyperproductivity, late working hours, minimal sleep, over and under eating, chronic stress, anxiety, and unprocessed trauma are all, quote-unquote, normal parts of our daily life and experiences, but there is nothing normal or healthy about them. The evidence of this is that it is making us sick. These normal parts of a life are chronic stressors that put a psychological and physical weight on us that we're not equipped nor made to carry. And the result it is yielding is illness, depression, anxiety, fatigue, addiction. These are signposts, evidence that the way things are isn't working. And more than that, it's the cause. Maté calls this our toxic culture. He says, we live a toxic culture. Another way of saying it, chronic illness, mental or physical, is to a large extent a function or feature of the way things are, and not a glitch, but rather a consequence of how we live, not a mysterious aberration. The way we live is making us stressed and sick. It isn't a surprise or a mistake. It's a consequence of the way things are. My belief in the necessity of a breakdown is for the sole purpose of interrupting this toxic and chronic pattern of living that is making us unhappy and sick, and finding out how to continue to live in a way that doesn't cause us to malfunction. To redefine normality, not simply as just the way things are done, whether we like it or not, but to define normality as the ways of being that most promote our health and well-being and honour and satisfy our natural way of functioning. Our current idea of normal isn't working. I'm going to read another passage from The Myth of Normal that explains this in a bit more detail. When explaining the purpose of the book, Maté writes, "I will make the case that much of what passes for normal in our society is neither healthy nor natural, and that to meet modern society's criteria for normality in many ways is to conform to requirements that are profoundly abnormal in regard to our nature-given needs, which is to say, unhealthy and harmful on the physiological, mental, and even spiritual levels. In other words, our society is not set up in a way that promotes health, well-being, and peace, and we see the consequences of that everywhere and call it normal, rather than something abnormal that hinders our ability to function in a healthy way that needs to be fixed." I found this in my own recovery, particularly as someone who for a long time was both a perfectionist, addicted to being productive, but also a chronic procrastinator. My neglect of my nature-given needs for rest, recreation, good food, kindness, patience, love, all eroded away at my soul and my body and left me unable to know who I was. I didn't have the time or resources, and when I did, I was afraid of what I'd find. So I procrastinated and numbed out with substances and things, food, fantasy, TV, books, anything attention-grabbing and loud enough to block out what my body was trying to tell me. That I was in trouble, that I was struggling and scared, afraid of the uneasy awareness that my life was out of my control. And the reasons were too much to face. I was afraid to find out why. Most people understand trauma to be the result of a singular event, or multiple events that have lifelong effect. However, Maté describes trauma as not just one singular event that occurs and upsets the course of your life and well-being, but rather trauma exists on a spectrum. He writes, "Trauma pervades our culture. In fact, someone without the marks of trauma would be an outlier in our society. We are closest to the truth when we ask, where do we each fit on the broad and surprisingly inclusive trauma spectrum?" It gets many people's backs up when they hear the word trauma. A lot of people who haven't been through something like war or a car accident often think they don't qualify to consider themselves as someone who has been through or harbours trauma. To be quote-unquote traumatized comes with layers of stigma for each individual. But as Maté describes it, trauma is a lot more nuanced than that. Maté says, trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you. Think of a car accident where someone sustains a concussion. The accident is what happened, the injury is what lasts. Likewise, trauma is a psychic injury lodged in our nervous system, mind and body, lasting long past the originating incident or incidents, triggerable at any moment. This means we are all susceptible to traumatic psychic injury without even having to have put on combat boots or been physically injured, because trauma happens on the inside. To continue, Maté asks, what is trauma? As I use the word trauma is an inner injury, a lasting rupture or split from within the self due to difficult or hurtful events. By this definition, trauma is primarily what happens within someone as a result of the difficult or hurtful events that befall them. It is not the events themselves. Bessel van der Kolk, another leading trauma expert and psychiatrist, describes trauma as trauma is when we are not seen and known. So a better way to understand trauma as it applies to ourselves is with more flexible categories and on a spectrum. Maté goes on to describe big T trauma and small t trauma. Big T trauma being the major traumatic events we think of like war, natural disaster, serious injury, child abuse and domestic violence. Small t trauma is considered a lot more personal, like loss, betrayal and heartbreak. What matters is that whether we realise it or not, we have likely all experienced some form of trauma, big T or small t, and lie somewhere on that trauma spectrum. What's important about this and important about understanding that trauma is a much bigger category than it's seen as in popular culture is that the effects of trauma across the board affect us in similar ways. Maté writes that big T and small t trauma both represent a fracturing of the self and of one's relationship to the world. That fracturing is the essence of trauma. As psychotherapist Peter Levin writes, trauma is about a loss of connection to ourselves, our families, and the world around us. This loss is hard to recognise because it happens slowly over time. In a society where we chronically disconnect from ourselves and our needs, where we neglect ourselves and numb ourselves to the pain and consequences that causes, the cavern that is created within us, that loss of connection to ourselves grows wider apart. We suffer the effects of trauma. The issue is that we hardly have the time or the silence to even realise it, let alone fix it, unless of course in many cases you're forced to stop and deal with it, because you've been interrupted by a breakdown or some other physical interruption. So why does it have to go that far before we realise something's wrong? Maté writes, if trauma entails a disconnection from the self, then it makes sense to say that we are being collectively flooded with influences that both exploit and reinforce trauma. Work pressures, multitasking, social media, news updates, multiplicities of entertainment sources, these all induce us to become lost in thoughts, frantic activities, gadgets, and meaningless conversations. We are caught up in pursuits of all kinds that draw us in, not because they are necessary or inspiring or uplifting, or because they enrich or add meaning to our lives, but simply because they obliterate the present. Awareness of the moment has become something to fear. I want to say that again. Awareness of the moment has become something to fear. The meaning of the word trauma in its Greek origin is wound. Whether we realise it or not, it is our woundedness or how we cope with it that dictates much of our behaviour, shapes our social habits and informs our ways of thinking about the world. It can even determine whether or not we are capable of rational thought at all in matters of the greatest importance to our lives. And I would say that that is what your breakdown is causing you to finally connect to. Awareness. Is the life you are currently living, the way you are living it, working for you? Sometimes your body, like mine did, answers that question for you. Sometimes in the form of a breakdown or an illness. Whatever it takes to get you to stop and pay attention, to become aware. In the rest of Maté's book, The Myth of Normal, he explains in depth the connection between trauma and various illnesses and immune disorders, the patterns and examples he's seen in his own practice of how unaddressed and unreleased trauma erodes away at the body. I'd like to read one other quote that sums up a lot of what Maté is explaining in his book. And this was my own experience with illness and my own breakdown. If we could begin to see much illness itself not as a cruel twist of fate or some nefarious mystery, but rather as an expected and therefore normal consequence of abnormal and unnatural circumstances, it could have revolutionary implications for how we approach everything health-related. Health and illness are not random states in a particular body or body part. They are in fact an expression of an entire life lived, one that cannot in turn be understood in isolation. It is influenced by, or better yet, it arises from a web of circumstances, relationships, events, and experiences. What I found in my own experience and research reading books like Maté's or Bessel van der Kolk, Pete Walker, and many other writers psychotherapists and doctors and forums, is the consistency of the same effects and symptoms across the board. Whether it be big T or small t trauma, the same 5 symptoms kept popping up: anxiety, depression, addiction, self-hatred, self-harm. What I call the Big 5. Everything from experiencing an accident, divorce, bullying, abuse to overworking, busy work schedule, lack of sleep, poor diet, people-pleasing, self-abnegation and neglect, being unable to ask for help, lack of boundaries, the list goes on. No matter what, if unchecked and treated, they all seem to lead to the Big 5. Anxiety, depression, addiction, self-hatred, and self-harm. So the reason why I'm an advocate for a good old-fashioned breakdown is because you need it. You need time to figure out what it is that is causing you to feel the way you are currently feeling. What you're experiencing are symptoms of something else. If you dislike yourself, feel unhappy, are depressed, anxious, wrestling with addiction and disordered eating, you're not abnormal. You are experiencing the simple universal law of cause and effect, the consequences of living in a toxic culture. A toxic culture that gaslights you by calling itself normal when it's not. Your difficulties and stresses should exist as evidence to you that regardless of what you think you should or could be feeling or experiencing, the reality is that the way you are currently experiencing your life isn't working positively for you. You have and are experiencing the wide spectrum of trauma in its varying forms, so change is needed. You need to ask yourself, what is my trauma? Self-hate and dislike are more often than not shown through self-neglect, a neglect of tending to one's own needs and desires, everything from rest, nutrition and exercise to personal hygiene, which is commonly considered a symptom of depression. It's a big indicator of unaddressed trauma, self-suppression and disregard that none of us are born with. Here's another one. Not being able to ask for help was called super-autonomous self-sufficiency by researchers at the Heidelberg University in Germany in 1982. We've all met those people, and maybe are those people, who would rather die than ask for help. Some even wear it like a badge of honor despite the fact it's a very common indicator of developmental trauma. There's more. Toxic self-blame is very common in children and adults who have suffered abuse. Toxic shame and a disconnect from one's own feelings, feeling numb or nothing, or alternatively feeling too much or being overly sensitive. I experience both. I would oscillate from feeling so disconnected from myself, feeling nothing that I didn't feel real, and neither did the world around me. This is called depersonalization and derealization, and they are different forms of disassociation, and are, you guessed it, a sign and symptom of trauma. Also, chronic boredom. Do you ever just feel so bored of everything, of being you, of living, that even in circumstances where you know you should feel happy or excited, you just don't? And of course we can't forget self-loathing. What makes all these things toxic and traumatic is that they come from a wound within us, and if we never take the time to tend to and heal that wound, like any other, it gets infected and begins to rot and hurt and burn until you are finally in too much pain and desperate enough to do something about it. Why am I being so serious about this? Why I know and believe it's important to heal and to love yourself is because the consequences of not doing so in the long term are pretty dire, mentally and physically. Again, I'd encourage you to read Maté's book or listen to one of his many interviews, to read Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, to see just how adept at holding on to trauma and hurt and pain our bodies actually are, even the things we don't remember. But the gist is, the trauma and stress that goes unaddressed within you can kill you. It can make you physically sick, and it's not worth it to not deal with it. Sometimes our bodies, like-minded, make that choice for us, make us unable to carry on living the way we were, or the way we are. A friend of mine, a fellow traveller, calls this the gift of desperation, the thing that pushes us towards actually getting help, to getting over ourselves and our pride to admit that something is wrong and we have to find a way to fix it. What I want you to understand more than anything in this episode is that you are not the way you currently are for no reason. And that reason is trauma, and you need to find out why. Many of us, as Levin calls it, are living in the tyranny of the past, without even realizing it, sick and numb and hating ourselves, but too afraid to look beyond the veil of our symptoms to the wound underneath, because there is something in our society so toxic and prevalent that seems to encourage us to be embarrassed about acknowledging, accepting, and admitting that we have been affected by our lives, by the way we live, the jobs we work, what we eat and think and do, and the people we call friends. But it is necessary to come to terms with the fact that whether you like it or not, your life has affected you. It affects all of us, regardless of if we pretend it does or not. We are all affected. It's not just you. People tend to berate and belittle themselves for their inability to cope, to be hyperproductive, continually busy and happy and energetic on top of that, fixated on how they think they should or could be, the things they would do if they were just better at all of it, somehow a better person, that would fix all their problems, without turning their perspective to observe and ask, is what is being asked of me even doable or attainable? And is it doable without causing exhaustion, burnout, fatigue, and stress? Or is what is being expected of me, and what I expect of myself, unrealistic and worse yet, toxic to my health and well-being? Addiction to overachievement and performance-based value, seeing it as a badge of honor to be a workaholic or busyholic, to neglect your health, quality time with loved ones, recreation and seeking joy as some kind of moral high ground. It's not. It is wearing you down and making you sick. It's like that person who some of us, myself included, who have been truly sick and come to work anyway because their dedication to work outweighed their loyalty to themselves and taking care of their health. The person who doesn't stop to think for 5 minutes, am I putting others at risk by showing up to work sick? Why is my productivity more important to me than myself and others? It never just affects you. There are also many people who don't have a choice. You may live paycheck to paycheck, and your bills need to be paid. You have family to support. It is not economically feasible for you to disconnect and take a break. The consequences, homelessness, starvation, etc. are far bigger issues to face than whether or not you feel good. And what I'm trying to do here isn't to tell you to quit your jobs and stick it to the man. As much as I would like that, and for some of you that might be exactly what you need to do. What I am saying is realize that these things are affecting you. And in doing that, please don't be so hard on yourself. Your struggle, fatigue, depression, unhappiness, hopelessness is a symptom of our toxic culture, not an inherent character flaw in you. And if you don't have the means to get out of that toxic culture, or even if you do, having a negative self-regard, hating yourself and beating yourself up for not somehow having more energy or good feelings within you is only going to make it harder. And I am trying, with this podcast, not to sell you a utopian ideal, but to work with what you've got in a realistic and manageable way so that even if you are struggling, you're able to treat yourself with the patience, kindness, and compassion you deserve to make all of this at least a little bit more bearable. To come home from a hard day of work and attend to your needs, not neglect or belittle them, but fill yourself up when and where you can with the kind of self-compassion that is healing and doesn't make an already hard life that much harder. I mean, come on, you hate your job, your life, and you hate yourself? When do you catch a break? There are so many things that are out of our control, but we are not one of those things. We can create within ourselves that safe and secure place we might not be able to get outside of ourselves, where we can foster the right internal environment that can bring about external change. That is what I want for you, for us. Amen? A breakdown forces you to start from the beginning, to go back to the foundation and the basics. That's what we're doing in this podcast. A breakdown gets you to a place where you stop making judgments based on what you think you should do, but on what's realistically feasible and beneficial to you. That is an act of love. That communicates your value, your worth and worthiness to experience productivity that doesn't deplete you and rest when you require it. It is a chance to reconnect with your body mind, that vital and neglected connection, and learn what it's trying to tell you. Only then will you be able to have the raw materials to begin loving yourself. How can you love someone you constantly ignore? You can't. So let's start listening to what we're saying physically and internally. And if it's possible, I'd recommend taking as much time as you can to not be in your regular routine, to stop the distractions and lay aside the numbing agents and begin to investigate what they're trying to hide. This is a lot. For many reasons, for many people, for you. So I want to try and keep it simple. Maybe you can't take that time off, but what you can do is factor some time in. As Maté and Levin and Van der Kolk say, if trauma is fundamentally a disconnection to self, we need to start slowly and patiently rebuilding that connection to ourselves. We need to know what our body mind is telling us. We need to know how we feel, because how we feel will help us figure out what's wrong and what needs to be changed and fixed. This exercise will take less than an hour a day and can be fit in at any point in your day. I call it my 20-minute recoup. For 20 minutes, set a timer on your phone or watch, whatever doesn't require you to watch the minutes go by. Find a comfortable place to sit and just do nothing. All I want you to do is pay attention to what's happening in your body. Don't do anything in particular, just sit there in complete silence, or as quiet as your environment will allow, and wait. Listen. Pay attention to how this makes you feel. Do you feel relaxed or okay? Anxious or agitated, angry or bored? This isn't meditating. You don't have to silence your thoughts. This isn't for any purpose other than to train yourself to be inside your body and listen to what you need, fully present for 20 minutes. No distractions. Here you are your own passive and non-judgmental observer. Experiment with shifting your focus to different parts of the body. I prefer doing this linearly from my feet to my legs, torso upwards, in order from the ground up, but do whatever works for you. Shifting your attention to isolated physical parts of yourself and just holding your awareness for a couple of seconds. You may or may not be surprised at how excruciating and uncomfortable that first 10 minutes feels, especially when you're just starting out. But stick with it. You'll settle eventually. Additionally, when you're finished, roughly write down what it felt like in your body. Did you feel heart palpitations in your chest? Were your hands sweaty? Did you feel calm or prickly? Do you have any pain? How did the silence make you feel? Or you can just think about it. When the 20 minutes is up, ask yourself one thing. What do I need? This is ARR, assess, reevaluate, respond, in little form. It will teach you to listen to what your body and mind are trying to tell you. What you need might surprise you. More time, a hug, some sugar, a cup of tea, a walk, a shower. You'll be surprised how benign but effective your needs are at first. But you have to act on them for this exercise to be effective, for you to learn and teach yourself to become aware of your needs and begin to respond to them. To teach yourself that you will do your best when you are able to meet them. Do this as many times a week as you can. This is honestly just giving yourself a break from the noise, from the distractions. 20 minutes just for you. If 20 minutes sounds like too much, start at 5, then work up to 10 until you can make it to 20. Some of us truly do not stop long enough in the day to know how we're feeling, inside and out, to listen to what our body mind is telling us. No pressure, no strings attached. You owe yourself that. I'd like to add as well, it doesn't have to be a big event. You don't have to fluff the pillows and light the candles. Just do it where you can. In the break room at work, in the bathroom, In that small window of time between making the family dinner and setting the table, or, as I often find myself doing, just as I reach the point of exhaustion from scrolling too long on my phone, quickly setting the timer and throwing the phone across the room for a last minute, 20 minutes of peace. So, to end here, consider having a breakdown. A healthy one, that is, where you can assess, reevaluate, and respond. And if that's not possible right now, go easy on yourself and try out the task for a couple of weeks and observe what comes up. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the podcast. And listener, if no one's ever told you or if no one ever meant it, you deserve love. Now go love yourself. As always, the episode resources and references, disclaimers and social media links will be in the show notes and description. The uncensored audio podcast episodes are available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Details on how to support the podcast are also listed in the show notes and description if you feel so inclined. If you would like access to the uncensored vodcast of the episode you just watched, as well as journal prompts and reading material, this is available through Patreon membership. Sign up to the mailing list to keep up to date with what happens next with the channel and the future of the podcast. All of this information and more about us can also be found on the Scattered Seeds website. Bye.